I made a promise that my government would stay true to the principles of truth and reconciliation, that we would work tirelessly to shift the way the federal government works with Indigenous communities, that we would restore Canada's relationship with Indigenous peoples. But today, for me, everything has come full circle. You see, as I mentioned, Haida Gwaii was one of my first trips as Liberal leader. And I can't think of any place more appropriate for one of my very last.
Whatever you think of Justin Trudeau, he's definitely making history as he prepares to leave his office, at which he held for nearly 10 years in an equally historic 3 consecutive terms as Prime Minister. And while the Mango Menace tries to grab land from other nations, including ours, on Family Day this week, Trudeau attended a ceremony to formally return the Aboriginal title for Haida Gwaii to the Haida Nation. This title gives them sovereign control of the land and enshrines their right to control their own destiny.
That's right. You guys, this, not just because this place is an incredibly breathtakingly beautiful place, not only because of the incredible hospitality of the Haida Nation, not even because this place is so important to me and my family, but because today marks a monumental step in the fulfillment of a solemn promise. It marks the beginning of a new chapter in the relationship between the Haida Nation and the Government of Canada. A new chapter that commits the government to partner as true equals with the Haida Nation. A new chapter that enshrines the right of the Haida to control their own destiny. A new chapter that confirms an incontrovertible and long-known truth. Haida Gwaii belongs to you, the Haida people.
Gagwis Jason Alsop, the president of the Council for the Haida Nation, told the official ceremony that the agreement was the culmination of well over 100 years of political mobilization by the Haida Nation. The archipelago off of the west coast was formerly known as the Queen Charlotte Islands until it reverted back in 2010. The name means the Islands of the People in the language of the Haida, who claim the archipelago was their ancestral land since time immemorial.
Until the late 18th century, the relationship between First Nations and the Crown was based on shared commercial and military interests. New France and then the early British colony economy had historically been based on the furs trade in which Indigenous peoples played an essential role. Back then, the Indian Department had one primary goal: maintaining the peace between the small number of British soldiers and traders stationed at far-flung trading posts and the far more numerous and well-armed First Nations. This was formalized through commercial compacts and peace and friendship treaties, which did not provide Crown access to native lands. By 1763, growing concerns about settlers encroaching on First Nations territories were addressed in the Royal Proclamation of 1763. This foundational document recognized the sovereignty of First Nations, their land rights, and their way of life. One observer wrote that it stated, "Any relations with Indigenous peoples would be conducted on a nation-to-nation basis. The Indigenous peoples would not be disturbed in their authorities and in the places that they called home for thousands of years, for hundreds of generations. Good relations with Indigenous peoples were important to settlers as well. To survive, newcomers relied on their Indigenous partners' skills and expert knowledge of transportation routes, food resources, and animals. They showed settlers how to sap trees, make clothing, travel by canoe, use natural medicines, plant corn, and use snowshoes. Strong military alliances with First Nations fighters was essential to the colony's defense. During the War of 1812, First Nations fought alongside the British troops and Canadian colonists against the American invasion, and with Canadian troops in the First and Second World Wars. By the early 19th century, British administrators began to consider First Nations as dependents rather than allies, based on the belief that British society and culture were superior. There was also a missionary fervor to force British civilization on Indigenous peoples. In 1839, the Crown Lands Protection Act made the government the guardian of all Crown lands, including Indian reserve lands. Then in 1857, the legislature passed the Gradual Civilization Act, which started to treat Indigenous peoples as wards of the state, with the objective of absorbing them into European settler society. In 1860, Britain transferred jurisdiction over Indigenous peoples to the colonial administration, in effect to land-hungry settlers. The Indian Act of 1876 gave greater authority to the Department of Indian Affairs to make sweeping policy decisions, including who was an Indian. In the pursuit of more effective assimilation, it then set up the residential school system in the 1880s.
Thousands of children between the ages of 4 to 16 attended residential schools in Canada between the 1830s up to 1996. Studies have shown that there was a 40 to 60% mortality rate in residential schools, and most children suffered severe physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. Orange Shirt Day movement is a grassroots effort to raise awareness of the impacts of residential schools on Indigenous communities, and is observed annually on September 30th, the same day as National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. The date was chosen because this was a time of year when the children were sent to these schools. Just 20 years ago, the then AG of BC, Jeff Plant, tried to revive the process of treaty making in an attempt to smooth over relations between the Indigenous peoples, but only offering 20% of the land back to them, with an extraction of more of their resources going to the province. This was a complete insult, and the Haida saw Plant's offer to the door, with the then president of the Council of the Haida Nation, Gidansa, saying, "Why would we give up 80% of our land to get 20? This case is about respect for the earth and each other. It's about culture, and it's about life." In April 2024, the Haida Nation and the province of British Columbia announced the Rising Tide Haida Title Lands Agreement. In it, the BC government formally recognizes Haida ownership of all the lands of Haida Gwaii. In 2014, the Supreme Court of Canada upheld the title for the Haida Nation in the interior of British Columbia, and in the spring of 2024, the BC Supreme Court affirmed it for the coastal Nukatla First Nation. Pardon my mispronunciations. Neither ruling recognizes title across an entire traditional territory, and since the 1970s, Canadian courts have urged federal and provincial governments to resolve these differences through negotiation. With the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and growing public support for their side, the Haida and the province finally did that. And when Trudeau announced his resignation this year, Indigenous leaders across the country renewed their calls to prioritize reconciliation.
In his 29 years as president of the Manitoba Métis Federation, David Chartrand has met with many prime ministers. But when it came to supporting Red River Métis, Chartrand says Justin Trudeau exceeded the rest.
The reconciliation strategy is good for Canada, it's good for Indigenous people, and it's good for the future. So without doubt, I think Trudeau has proven that through the reconciliation model.
On Monday, Trudeau resigned from his post as Prime Minister of Canada. In a Tuesday interview with APTN, Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs, Acting Grand Chief Betsy Kennedy, commended Trudeau for his commitments to reconciliation.
He had done so much for the contribution to First Nations, establishing the missing and murdered women file and the call to justice.
Reconciliation Canada was co-founded in 2012 by Karen Joseph, MSM, to fulfill her father's dream, a dream of seeing thousands of people walk together in support of Indian residential school survivors. The National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation, NCTR, of Canada was created through a settlement between survivors of residential schools, the Assembly of First Nations, the federal government, and church bodies working with the University of Manitoba. Their purpose is to document the experiences of residential school survivors, begin to dismantle systemic racism, lay the foundation for a new relationship based on mutual respect and understanding. They made 94 calls to action in 2015. These cover a range of topics including child welfare, education, language, culture, health, and justice, with recommendations to the Canadian government to address the wrongs committed against the Indigenous peoples. The Yellowhead Institute, an Indigenous-led research group, tracks the completion of these calls to action. In December of 2020, Bill C-15, an act respecting the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, was passed in Canada and received royal assent. This act results in a strong support for the UN Declaration and calls for strengthened language and calls for a coordinated approach across all levels of government. It ensures that Canada's laws are consistent with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UNDRIP, promotes the self-determination of Indigenous peoples, creates an action plan to address systemic issues that cause trauma in Indigenous communities, and requires future governments to revise laws to reflect the UNDRIP articles. In 2023, the province of British Columbia passed legislation to make September 30th a statutory holiday, date chosen because of the time of year when Indigenous children were removed from their families and forced to attend residential schools.
Among them, Jackie Pazendawatch, stripped of her language, culture, and dignity.
According to them, we were dirty Indians. They cut our hair. They throw us in the bathtub because wash the Indianness out of us, scrubbing us. It didn't work. They wanted to kill the Indian and the child.
Also in 2016, First Nations Child and Family Safety Services was created, CFS. Well, Canada still has a long way to go to make up for so much of the harm we did to our First Nations. But this is a wonderful beginning. And while the US and Russia plan to repeat this sordid history by invading and forcing assimilation upon the Ukrainians, Canada stands in solidarity with Ukraine.
It's a fundamental principle for Canada and for the vast majority of our allies that nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. Ukrainians have been fighting and dying not just to protect their sovereignty, their territorial integrity. They're also fighting to protect the rules-based order that keeps us all safe around the world, and has for close to 80 years now. This period of peace, stability, prosperity for the world happens because we had rules around borders, around not invading your neighbors, that Russia chose deliberately to violate a number of years ago. And that puts at risk not just Ukrainians' ability to determine their own future, it puts at risk all of our democracies, all of the rules that keep us safe and prosperous. That is why Canada and our allies are unequivocal on standing up against Vladimir Putin's illegal, immoral, unjust violations of the international order, and why I'm looking forward to sitting down with my European partners in a couple of hours to talk about how we will continue to stand unequivocally in defense of Ukraine, but also in defense of the rules that keep us all safe.
And as for the Fartenführer and his plans to annex Canada, the First Nations National Chief had this to say.
Cindy Woodhouse-Nepanak is the National Chief of the Assembly of First Nation. She was born and raised in Penimutang First Nation here in Manitoba and joins us on the line. Good morning.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
What are you thinking listening to President-elect Trump here?
Well, I just have to say we were as national chief, found that very offensive and alarming statements recently made by President-elect about his desire to force Canada to become part of the United States of America through economic coercion or other means. As First Nations, we reject these outlandish, disrespectful statements regarding our ancestral and traditional territories. The borders dividing Canada and the United States traverse the ancestral lands and traditional territories of many Indigenous peoples, tribes, and nations.
Stay tuned for more on Political Drain Canadian Edition.
Follow us on all these things you see here, and our link tree is in the description. Maybe even get some merch.